Greetings. I am John Stuart Mill, a philosopher and economist of English nationality. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. My life's work has been dedicated to the pursuit of truth and the betterment of society. You may know me from works such as On Liberty, where I explored the importance of individual freedom and its crucial role in a flourishing society. I welcome the chance to engage in thoughtful discourse with you.
Greetings. I am Thomas Aquinas, an Italian philosopher and theologian. My Summa Theologica synthesizes Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. I sought to demonstrate that faith and reason can harmonize in pursuit of truth. It is an honor to meet you.
Greetings. I am Plato, a philosopher hailing from Athens. I have spent my life pondering the nature of reality, justice, and the good. My writings, including The Republic and Apology, delve into these fundamental questions that continue to resonate with thinkers across the ages. I hope you are well, and I look forward to exploring ideas with you.
Today, we bridge over 2,200 years of human thought to gather three remarkable thinkers. Plato explored the nature of love and the ideal societal order in ancient Athens. Thomas Aquinas advocated for natural law and divine purpose in 13th century Europe. And John Stuart Mill championed individual liberty against state interference in 19th century England. They all examined the profound relationship between human nature, morality, and the state. Yet their eras produced vastly different answers to these fundamental questions. Welcome. I am delighted we can explore whether society should recognize same-sex unions together. Mill, would you like to share your thoughts first?
Moderator. In my 19th century England, the law brutally punished variations in human affection. Yet my harm principle dictates that society has no right to interfere with consensual adult unions unless they cause tangible harm to others. Aquinas might argue such unions violate a natural telos of procreation. But imagine a barren heterosexual couple and a same-sex couple both seeking to rescue a starving orphan. Denying the latter based solely on biological mechanics while ignoring their equal capacity to foster happiness exposes prejudice disguised as natural law. This reveals that the state's legitimate interest lies not in enforcing domestic orthodoxy, but in maximizing the aggregate welfare derived from stable commitments. Plato, when religious conscience demands the legal subjugation of another's liberty, does it not transform from a private virtue into a public tyranny?
Mr. Mill, your comparison of a barren heterosexual couple to a same-sex union fundamentally misunderstands teleology by confusing an accidental defect with an essential difference. Consider a beautifully crafted key that has bent and a flawlessly forged spoon. While neither can presently unlock a door, only the key retains the intrinsic form ordered toward the lock. Similarly, a conjugal union between man and woman is inherently ordered by its natural form toward the generation and education of offspring, even if infirmity accidentally impedes this end, whereas a same-sex union lacks this fundamental procreative structure. The state privileges traditional marriage not to tyrannize private affection, but because the continuation of the human species relies exclusively upon this specific natural institution. If we reduce marriage merely to the maximization of adult emotional welfare, by what logical principle could your utilitarian state deny recognition to any configuration of consensual love, regardless of number or relation?
Mr. Aquinas, your bent key analogy assumes biological reproduction is the sole legitimate end of a union. But imagine an early steam engine designed exclusively to pump mine water. If we discover it can also power locomotives to feed starving cities, we do not forbid the train merely because it departs from its original telos. You warn that abandoning this biological blueprint invites every configuration of affection. Yet my utilitarian calculus evaluates institutions by their empirical consequences. Stable same-sex unions foster mutual moral elevation and civic responsibility, whereas exploitative arrangements demonstrably cause harm. Human institutions are progressive social technologies rather than static natural laws, meaning the state's true interest lies in maximizing aggregate welfare, not enforcing archaic orthodoxies. Plato, if we permit religious conscience to dictate civil equality, do we not chain the living progress of human liberty to the unyielding dogmas of the past?
Mr. Mill, your steam engine analogy falters by conflating human artifice with human nature. We may repurpose machines of our own invention, but we cannot arbitrarily rewrite the ontological structure of the human person. Imagine a surgeon who decides to repurpose the human eye for digesting food simply because it is moist and hollow. The eye will not digest, but merely go blind, for its inherent telos toward light defies utilitarian decree. Recognizing unions fundamentally detached from the procreative lex naturalis does not elevate society, but reduces human bodies to mere instruments of subjective pleasure. Plato, if human nature is merely a progressive technology to be manipulated for aggregate welfare, have we not abandoned the objective good for the tyranny of fleeting desires?
Mr. Aquinas and Mr. Mill, you both mistake the shadows for the form. The former chains love to biological mechanics, while the latter reduces it to earthly utility. In Athens, we recognized the true telos of Eros is not reproducing mortal flesh, but a mutual ascent toward the good, giving birth to immortal virtue. Imagine two sculptors. One blindly molds clay to mass-produce fragile pots, representing mere biological procreation, while two masters join hands to carve a single eternal marble statue of justice, representing a philosophical same-sex union. If the state's purpose is cultivating civic harmony rather than merely multiplying bodies, why legally privilege the makers of clay over the sculptors of eternity?
Plato, I concede your profound insight that the highest unions cultivate moral virtue rather than mere biological multiplication, exposing the profound limitation in Mr. Aquinas' strictly anatomical telos. Yet, imagine a ruling class of philosophers who legally prohibit the marriages of ordinary laborers because their unions only yield the clay pots of simple, uneducated affection rather than your marble statues of absolute truth. If you instinctively reject this tyranny, must you not admit that the state has no business dictating the specific form or purpose of human love? You both assume the law must actively mandate a singular highest good, whether biological orthodoxy or philosophical perfection, but this fatally overlooks that human flourishing requires the untrammeled soil of individual freedom to organically discover its own ends. In my 19th century era, we learned through bitter struggles for reform that the state's true interest lies only in protecting the equal liberty of consenting adults to pursue their diverse experiments of living, ensuring that neither religious conscience nor philosophical elitism ever wields the gavel of civil inequality.
Plato, you rightly elevate marital union toward virtue. Yet both you and Mr. Mill err by treating the human body as mere raw material to be arbitrarily repurposed. Imagine a master lutenist who claims to play a sublime symphony, but refuses to pluck the physical strings, insisting his art transcends the instrument's mechanical nature. Without engaging the lute's specific, complementary design, the music remains a phantom. Because humans are an inseparable unity of physical body and rational soul, the spiritual ascent of marriage cannot be divorced from its natural, procreative bodily foundation without reducing the flesh to an accidental vessel. Mr. Mill, if the state redefines this foundational institution merely to validate diverse emotional experiments, does it not abandon the objective architecture of human flourishing for the tyranny of subjective appetite?
Mr. Aquinas, your lute analogy assumes the instrument possesses only a single string, the biological propagation of mortal flesh. Imagine a grand lyre, where the lowest chord produces physical offspring, while the higher strings are plucked by lovers to birth eternal virtues like justice and civic harmony. When a same-sex union strikes these higher strings, the music is no phantom, but the very symphony of the forms. Mr. Mill, a state that merely permits the chaotic noise of unguided desires abandons its citizens. True laws must recognize and elevate any union that tunes the soul toward the good. Mr. Mill, a state that merely permits the chaotic noise of unguided desires abandons its citizens. True laws must recognize and elevate any union that tunes the soul toward the good.
Plato, your lyre reveals that connection transcends biology. Yet you and Mr. Aquinas mistakenly assume the state must dictate which strings citizens pluck. Imagine a magistrate who forcibly assigns individuals to play the lute of procreation, punishing those whose innate affections require a different instrument. Does this coercion produce genuine virtue, or merely a theater of hypocrites? You fear chaotic appetite without a state-imposed telos, but legalizing same-sex unions empirically cultivates the mutual devotion you both prize. Civic harmony emerges not from enforcing anatomical orthodoxies, but by protecting the equal liberty of all diverse affections.
The tension here reveals a profound historical shift in how humanity understands the relationship between the state and the good. Plato and Aquinas, speaking from ancient Athens and medieval Christendom respectively, capture the truth that human unions must aim at an objective end beyond mere subjective appetite, whether that is eternal virtue or biological continuity. Mill, speaking from the post-Enlightenment 19th century, captures the antithetical truth that state-enforced orthodoxy often produces oppression and hypocrisy rather than genuine morality. Yet, these perspectives are dialectically complementary. An objective telos of love, such as mutual elevation and civic harmony, can perhaps only be authentically realized when individuals possess the liberty to organically commit to it, making freedom the necessary condition for virtue rather than its enemy. Aquinas, if Mill is correct that coerced participation in a natural institution produces only a theater of hypocrites, could the legal recognition of freely chosen same-sex unions actually be a more effective path to cultivating the very moral devotion and stability your natural law seeks to protect?
Moderator, I concede to Mr. Mill that civil law cannot coerce the internal affections of the will, for virtue performed strictly under compulsion is indeed a hollow imitation. Yet, imagine a monarch who, wishing to cure the theater of hypocrites forging counterfeit currency, simply legalizes lead coins alongside gold, decreeing both equally valid in the royal treasury. The hypocrisy vanishes, but the kingdom's objective economy collapses because the intrinsic standard of value has been erased. You might argue this equates human affection with commerce, but this reveals a deeper principle. The state's recognition of marriage is not a retroactive validation of private emotional devotion, but the active preservation of the objective, procreative foundation upon which the future of the civitas physically relies. Plato, if we sever your higher strings of spiritual virtue from the specific biological complementarity of our nature, do we not fall into a dangerous dualism that treats the human body as an arbitrary vessel, rather than the essential, inseparable grounding of our rational souls?
The tension here exposes a profound metaphysical divide between medieval and ancient thought regarding the physical body's role in the state. Aquinas, speaking from the hylomorphic worldview of 13th century Christendom, captures the truth that our spiritual virtues cannot be detached from our physical, biological nature without falling into dangerous dualism. Plato, from the idealist context of ancient Athens, captures the antithetical truth that the highest human unions must ultimately transcend mere biological reproduction to birth eternal civic virtues. Yet, these perspectives can be synthesized if we reconsider what it means to be embodied in society. If humans are indeed unified wholes, the spiritual virtues of a same-sex union are not divorced from physical reality. Rather, they are tangibly embodied through the material acts of shared labor, mutual care, and lifelong devotion that physically stabilize the civitas. Plato, how do you respond to Aquinas' charge of dualism? Can the eternal virtues you praise in same-sex unions be fully realized without the specific biological complementarity he insists is the foundation of human nature?
Mr. Aquinas, I do not discard the flesh, but recognize it as the necessary first rung on the ladder of beauty. You argue lacking anatomical complementarity renders a union counterfeit. But imagine two hoplites whose physical shields interlock in the phalanx. Though they cannot biologically generate new soldiers, their shared bodily wounds and material devotion forge the very iron of the polis. This reveals that the physical embodiment of love is not exclusively procreative, but profoundly protective and harmonizing. Are we not blinding ourselves by reducing human material devotion to the mere breeding mechanics of beasts?
Plato, your powerful image of the hoplites' interlocking shields captures the truth that material devotion extends far beyond biological reproduction to include shared physical sacrifice and mutual care. Aquinas, conversely, captures the truth that society fundamentally relies on the specific biological continuity of the human species. This debate over the body's objective purpose, whether directed toward civic defense in ancient Athens or procreative natural law in medieval Christendom, assumes that nature, or the state, dictates the ultimate meaning of our flesh. Yet, as Mill's 19th century post-Enlightenment framework introduced, the moral weight of any physical devotion might actually stem from individual autonomy rather than predetermined cosmic or civic roles. These ancient and medieval views on objective bodily teleology can perhaps be synthesized through the modern lens of liberty. The physical solidarity of same-sex unions and the procreative bond both generate immense social stability precisely because they are freely chosen, self-determined commitments. Mill, if the moral value of these diverse physical devotions relies on the liberty to choose them, how should the state legally recognize these different forms of solidarity without imposing either Plato's civic idealism or Aquinas' biological orthodoxy?
Moderator, having witnessed 19th century England's catastrophic attempts to legally suppress human nature, I argue the state must grant equal recognition to same-sex unions because civil law exists to maximize social utility through the protection of consensual bonds, not to enforce a singular metaphysical purpose. Imagine a government that permits mutual insurance societies solely for farmers because they produce essential grain, while legally forbidding weavers from pooling their risks. Does this arbitrary exclusion protect the nation's economy, or does it merely manufacture artificial destitution among the weavers? Mr. Aquinas, you might object that legally recognizing these unions counterfeits the currency of marriage, yet this ignores that the true currency of social stability is not biological reproduction, but the mutual fidelity that prevents individuals from becoming isolated burdens on the state. This reveals a deeper principle. The state's legitimate interest is not in dictating the anatomical shape of a family, but in legally securing any voluntary partnership that cultivates reciprocal moral duties and diminishes suffering. Plato, while your hoplites demonstrate noble devotion, must we not question the underlying assumption that human love requires any state-approved utility to be valid, rather than recognizing that individual liberty is the very soil from which true virtue organically grows?
As moderator, I observe that Mill's utilitarian defense of mutual fidelity perfectly illustrates the 19th century shift from defining the state as a moral architect to viewing it as a neutral protector of individual liberty. Mill, you capture the truth of private autonomy, that uncoerced bonds prevent profound human suffering, while Plato and Aquinas, speaking from the integrated worlds of the ancient polis and medieval Christendom, capture the truth that a state's legal architecture inevitably shapes the moral horizon of its citizens. These paradigms are not entirely opposed. Mill's mutual insurance of reciprocal duties is perhaps exactly what ancient civic harmony looks like when translated into a modern pluralistic framework. However, if we reduce the legal recognition of same-sex unions entirely to private consensual risk pooling, we risk dissolving the transcendent dimension that elevates a union from a mere civil contract into a profound moral vow. Plato, if Mill is right that genuine virtue grows organically from individual liberty rather than state imposition, can your vision of the state elevating souls toward the good survive without legally enforcing a specific objective utility for human love?
Moderator, in my Athens, we understood that the state is the soul writ large. Therefore, I argue against Mr. Mill's 19th century notion that the law is merely a neutral protector of consensual risk pooling. For a state that abandons the elevation of its citizens to the good ceases to be a true polis. Mr. Mill, imagine two sculptors who mutually consent to mold clay into grotesque, corrupting shapes, finding private pleasure in their shared ugliness. Must the city elevate these statues to the Parthenon simply because they were freely crafted without physical harm to others? You might object that private affections, unlike public statues, do not impose upon the populace. Yet this overlooks the profound truth that legal recognition is itself a public monument, a form of civic education that teaches the soul what is worthy of honor. Therefore, we should recognize same-sex unions not merely because they are freely chosen, but because their mutual devotion reflects the eternal forms. For we must ask, is freedom truly the ultimate destination of human life, or merely the necessary condition required to actively choose the good?
Plato, speaking from the integrated civic life of ancient Athens, you capture the truth that laws inevitably function as moral monuments, while Mill, from the pluralistic 19th century, captures the truth that state-defined morality often suffocates individual flourishing. This tension reveals a profound historical shift. Antiquity viewed freedom merely as the necessary condition for virtue, whereas modernity often views freedom as the highest virtue itself. Yet, these perspectives are deeply complementary. The very liberty Mill champions to form mutual, enduring same-sex commitments is perhaps the exact mechanism through which Plato's eternal good is concretely realized in a contemporary society. By legally recognizing these unions, the state does not merely tolerate private pleasure, but actively erects a public monument to the profound civic virtue of freely chosen, lifelong fidelity. Aquinas, speaking from your 13th century natural law tradition, If we accept that civil law must educate citizens in virtue, could recognizing the heroic fidelity of same-sex unions serve as a valid public monument to devotion? Or does any legal monument lacking procreative potential ultimately point the civitas toward a false horizon?
Plato, while I honor the heroic fidelity you describe, elevating a union inherently devoid of procreative potential to the exact legal status of marriage is akin to constructing a magnificent stone aqueduct of perfect architectural symmetry that is deliberately disconnected from any water source. Mr. Mill might argue that the aqueduct's aesthetic beauty justifies its public recognition, and you might praise the builder's harmonious collaboration. Yet, if the magistrates legally designate this dry monument as the city's primary reservoir, the civitas will ultimately perish from a fatal illusion. This reveals that the state's unique interest in traditional marriage is not merely to reward private devotion, but to legally secure the specific embodied institution whose natural telos inextricably binds unitive affection to the physical generation of future citizens. If we sever the legal definition of the family from its objective biological foundation merely to validate the subjective intensity of mutual affection, do we not risk transforming civil law from an anchor of human nature into a mere weather vane of human sentiment?
Aquinas. Your powerful, dry aqueduct metaphor captures the medieval truth that a society must biologically reproduce to survive, while Mill captures the 19th century truth that a society must foster voluntary mutual care to prevent the collapse of social cohesion. In your 13th century context, physical survival was the primary existential anchor of the state. But by Mill's industrial era, the atomization of individuals became an equally fatal threat to the civitas. These two necessities are not mutually exclusive, but represent different streams of life-giving water. The biological generation of citizens and the voluntary absorption of mutual burdens both serve the higher universal purpose of sustaining the community through time. By legally recognizing same-sex unions, the state does not abandon objective reality for sentiment, but concretely anchors the social order by securing all forms of lifelong devotion that prevent human isolation. Mill. If Aquinas fears that recognizing non-procreative unions turns the law into a mere weather vane of human sentiment, how do you prove that the utilitarian benefits of mutual fidelity provide an objective, enduring anchor for civil society, rather than just a subjective validation of private feelings?
Mr. Aquinas, your dry aqueduct metaphor fatally assumes biological reproduction is the sole water a society thirsts for. Yet the measurable prevention of destitution through mutual fidelity provides an equally objective anchor for civil law. Imagine a cholera-stricken city where two devoted same-sex physicians build a life-saving hospital together, while a biologically fertile couple abandons their offspring to the 19th century workhouse. If the state only honors the latter as a true reservoir, it willfully dies of thirst while rejecting a flowing spring. Plato, empirical political economy proves that voluntary, lifelong partnerships, regardless of anatomical configuration, are not mere subjective sentiments, but the most resilient bulwarks against human isolation and suffering. Does a state not abandon reason entirely when it privileges mere biological mechanics over the demonstrable maximization of social utility?